Hey everyone, today we are going to be talking about the importance of grammar. So go ahead and get out your notepads, your laptop, your tablet, whatever it is that you use to take notes, and we'll dive right in. So the question is, does grammar still matter in the age of social media that we all live in? So we have text messages, we have Instagram DMs, Snapchat, FaceTime. Everything we use basically has spell check, and of course, we have access to AI software that can seemingly do anything and everything for us, right? So, considering all of these things, does grammar still matter? Do we need to know how to spell? Do we need to know how to use a comma or how to use a colon or a semicolon? Do these things really matter? Go ahead and pause this video, take the next minute or two to answer this question, and be honest. Don't just think to yourself, oh, she's an English instructor, so of course she thinks grammar matters. So I'm going to say, yes, I think grammar matters. Be honest. I want to know what your opinion is, and I want you to bring your answers to class, right? Again, take the next 1 to 2 minutes, write down your answer as to why or why not grammar is still important, why you think we should or shouldn't continue to learn it, and bring it to class. So again, pause the video, answer that question, and then we will continue to move forward. Surprise, surprise. The answer is yes. Grammar is very, very, very important. I look forward to hearing what you guys actually wrote down on whether or not you feel grammar is important. And again, please don't change your answer just based on what I say after this, okay? But yes, grammar is extremely, extremely important, and hopefully the rest of this lecture will show you the reasons why. So there are a couple of different types of English. I mean, think about it. So the way we speak is very different than how people speak in the UK, right? It's the same language, but it's different. It sounds different. There are different nuances, just really all around different. Same language, lots of differences. Formal versus informal, right? Think of how you would speak to your friends versus how you're going to speak in a formal interview, right? Different. Same language, but just different types. Cultural and societal differences, right? Different cultures speak differently than others, right? And again, still English. We're not talking about different languages, but, if you grew up in a Hispanic community, you might speak, the language differently. You might use English differently than an Asian community would, or an African American community, right? Again, same English, but your culture and the society you grow up in or you're raised in has differences, right? In this class, we're going to be focusing on using standard American English. This is the English that you know and love. Maybe a little more formal, but it's the English that you've been exposed to, that you're used to, right? It's the type of English that's used in a professional and academic settings, and it really just creates a standard for understanding. We know exactly what type of English we're expected to use in class and with our assignments. So this is really just to set like a foundation for us moving forward. So what is grammar? Grammar is a set of rules and conventions that dictate how standard American English works. Like I said earlier, grammar really is the core structure of language. We cannot speak without using grammar, right? They are building blocks. They're the bricks that build the house that is language, right? Grammar is this, okay? So it's really important. Knowing proper grammar also increases credibility. So imagine you are interviewing somebody for a job, okay? You are an employer looking to hire somebody new, and the person sitting in front of you isn't using proper grammar when they're speaking, or they hand you their resume or their application, whatever it is, and you're reading it and everything is misspelled. Everything that should be capitalized isn't. It just doesn't look good. So knowing proper grammar gives you credibility, which is really important in the long run. There are a lot of different parts of grammar, but the things that we're going to focus on the most is punctuation, tense, spelling, word order, and connectors. Grammar determines meaning. This is very significant. Take a look at this example. It says, let's eat, Mom. Okay. What is this sentence saying, right? It's inviting your mom to eat with you, right? But without that little teeny tiny comma, it completely changes the meaning. You're no longer inviting your mom to eat with you, but you are inviting somebody else to eat your mom with you, right? You are suddenly a cannibal, no longer a host. Completely changes the meaning. Everything is the same here except for that one little piece of punctuation, right? Grammar determines meaning. Let's take a look at this one. I'd rather be pissed off than pissed on, okay? This is you saying, I would prefer this over this. But if we take a look at this sentence, I'd rather be pissed off than be pissed on. It sounds exactly the same, but one letter having an E instead of an A and then changes the meaning, right? It's no longer about you would rather do this than this. The second sentence is really an order of operations. I would rather be pissed off first, and then after that, somebody can pee on me. No problem, right? Totally different sentence, totally different meaning, right? It's very important to know this because what if you were trying to say the first one, but you used the wrong word and somebody reads it and they're like, interesting. Again, grammar determines meaning. Super important to get things right. Last but not least, my daughter had a running nose that I didn't want to catch. Again, another spelling issue. Instead of runny nose, it's running nose. And now it just literally doesn't make sense. Now it's just total nonsense, right? So do you see what I mean? Grammar determines meaning. It's really important to pay attention to these little tiny nuances. The comma is important. Spelling is important. All of those things, right? Grammar determines meaning. Okay, so let's move on and talk about specific parts of grammar, right? The building blocks, different parts of speech. These are going to be things that hopefully you've heard of before. Maybe you haven't talked about them in a while. Maybe you haven't learned about them since elementary school. So this will be a really good refresher for us. So first and foremost, a noun. These are our people, our places, and our things. A noun is the who or what that does something or has something done to them in a sentence. Sally went to the circus, right? Sally is a person, which is a noun. And then a circus, that's a place. So that is also a noun. Verbs. Verbs are the actions. They are the words that describe what a person or thing does, right? The verb describes what the noun does. Sally went to the circus. Went is the action. That would be the verb. Adjectives. So adjectives are descriptive words, but they specifically describe a noun. This is important to differentiate, especially when we get to our next word. So an adjective, a word that describes a noun. So take a look at this example. The sparkling vampire was staked. In this sentence, what do you think the noun is? Vampire. Vampire is the noun. Sparkling is describing the vampire. It's describing the noun, right? The sparkling vampire was staked, so sparkling would be considered an adjective, okay? This next word is also a descriptive word, but it's different than an adjective. This is called an adverb. So rather than describing a noun, adverbs describe a verb or another adjective. This can get kind of confusing. Hopefully, I'll walk you through the next example. It'll make a little more sense to you. So, adding on to the previous sentence in our previous example about the vampire, we have our new example that says the brightly sparkling vampire was quickly staked. So let's first start with quickly. Let's look at quickly. Okay. Quickly is describing how the vampire was staked. Because staked is a verb, right? That would be an adverb. Quickly is describing the verb, so quickly is an adverb, right? That's kind of an easy one to remember. An adverb describes a verb because verb is literally in the name. When it comes to describing an adjective, that's when it gets a little more confusing. So the brightly sparkling vampire was quickly staked. If we look back to the example for adjective, sparkling was the adjective because sparkling is describing the noun, right? That is still the same in our next example. The sparkling vampire was quickly staked, but we're just giving an additional word to describe the adjective a little bit better. The brightly sparkling vampire was quickly staked. Because brightly is describing the word sparkling further, and because sparkling is an adjective and an adverb describes an adjective, the word brightly would be an adverb. I know that's a little bit confusing, and I anticipate some of you to have questions about that. Please write that down in your questions log, right? That's a great question to need a little bit more clarification on. Again, I know it's a little bit more confusing, but hopefully with some practice and the more you recognize or the more you're exposed to words like this, the more easily you'll recognize them. Last but not least, we have our coordinating conjunctions. These are our connectors, okay? In elementary school, you were probably taught these as fanboys, right? Fanboys is an acronym that stands for and, nor, but, yet, so. So these are words that are connectors, right? He did this, and he did that. So that's a poor example. Sally went to the circus and she went to the beach. So the word and is connecting the fact that Sally went to the circus and Sally went to the beach, right? Do you see how that's a connector? Fanboys show up very frequently. They are in almost every sentence, basically. So this is something that you kind of want to know how to recognize, know the definition a little bit, just keep an eye out for. Okay, now that we've gone over the little bits and pieces of grammar, let's talk about what happens when we put these building blocks, these little parts of speech together. When we do that, we get a clause. That is just a fancy English major way to say sentence, okay? So whenever you see the word clause, just know that means sentence. There are two different types of clauses, two different types of sentences. We have an independent clause and we have a dependent clause. You probably have heard of these more frequently as a complete sentence or an incomplete sentence. Let's start by focusing on an independent clause. So like I said, this is a complete sentence. It is comprised of a subject and a predicate. These are another two fancy words for words that you already know. A subject is our noun, right? Person, place, or thing. And the predicate is the verb and everything else that follows the subject, okay? An independent clause, expresses a complete thought. It can stand on its own, stand by itself without any other words or phrases added onto it, and make sense. Take a look at these two examples up here in the top right-hand corner. So Barbie dominated the box office. That is a complete sentence. It expresses a complete thought. It makes sense by itself without having to give any further clarification, right? Barbie is our subject. That's our noun. And dominated the box office is the predicate, right? It is the verb dominated plus everything else that follows. Poppies are the state flower of California. Again, that expresses a complete thought. It is free to stand by itself and make perfect sense without needing any further clarity. It's not missing any parts, right? It's a complete sentence. You know exactly what it's saying, right? Poppies are our subject. It's our noun. And then are the state flower of California. That is our predicate. It is the verb, which here is are, the state flower of California. All of that is the predicate, okay? So those are examples of independent clauses, complete sentences that can stand on their own. Moving on to dependent clauses. So these are our incomplete sentences. They are also often referred to as sentence fragments. So a fragment is like a piece of something, meaning that a dependent clause is like a piece of a complete sentence, right? So a dependent clause can still have a subject and it can still have a predicate, just like an independent clause. But regardless of that, it still cannot express a complete thought. It can't stand on its own. So let's look at the examples over here. So when Bad Bunny sang. When Bad Bunny sang what? Do you see there's this anticipation, like there's this, you can tell that there's information that is being left out, and that means it's a sentence that can't stand on its own. What happens when Bad Bunny sings? There's more information needed for clarification. Same thing goes for the next example. As the Avengers assembled. As the Avengers assembled, what? What happens? Why is this important? There's missing information. It's a sentence fragment. It can't stand on its own. It's an incomplete thought, okay? Read your sentences out loud. This is a really big thing that students don't feel comfortable doing because it feels weird reading what you wrote out loud sometimes, but it's really, really, really helpful when you're trying to catch incomplete sentences, because when you read out loud when Bad Bunny sang, you can hear that there's something missing. So I encourage you that when you're writing an essay, really any kind of writing assignment, read it out loud. Your ears will catch mistakes that your eyes do not. So moving on, dependent clause danger words, okay? So these are a list of words that you should keep an eye out for when a sentence starts with these words. That's super key. So not just these words in general, but when a sentence starts with any of these words, it's indicating that you're setting up a two-part expression, okay? So keep an eye out for these words. We have after, as, although, because, before, if, in order, and since. So take a look at any of these examples, and if you read it out loud, you can hear that it's an incomplete sentence. So if I overslept. If I overslept, what? What happens? You can tell when you read these out loud that there's information missing, right? That this is part of a two-part expression. What is the other piece, right? So keep an eye out for these words at the beginning of sentences. When you hear any of these, when you see any of these, you should pause and think to yourself, okay, am I writing a complete sentence or am I creating a dependent clause that needs more information? I'm not saying don't ever create sentences that begin with any of these words. You absolutely can. There is no problem with that. The problem happens when you don't finish the thought, when you don't give the second part of the expression, right? So if I overslept, I'll get fired. Great. You know now that that's the second part of the expression. If you oversleep, here's what happens. There's two parts. There's no problem that I started the sentence with the word if. It's okay to start sentences with these danger words. Just make sure that you're finishing the thought. Here's some more dependent clause danger words. Though, unless, until, whatever, when, whenever, whether, and while. Again, same thing. Take a look at any of these examples, and when you read them out loud, you can hear that there's something missing. It's missing the second part of the two-part expression. So let's say you are writing your paper, you're writing an essay, and as you're reading it, you realize, oh shoot, I have some sentence fragments. How do we fix them? So there are a couple different ways. First, you can combine your dependent clause with an independent clause with just a little comma in between. So for example, because it was raining outside, that is a dependent clause. It starts with our danger word because, and it was raining outside. Because it was raining outside, what? Right? It's an incomplete sentence, it's a sentence fragment. The way we could fix that is we could add a comma and an independent clause right after it. So Mike didn't ride his bike to school is a complete sentence. So with a comma in between the two, it is grammatically correct. It's great. It is now a complete sentence that can stand on its own. Because it was raining outside, Mike didn't ride his bike to school. Here's another way you can fix it, is you can just straight up remove the danger word. Because it was raining outside. Again, our danger word is because. If we literally just remove it, and now the sentence is, it was raining outside. Grammatically correct, no problem, we're good to go. Okay, moving on. So run-on sentences. These are essentially the opposite of sentence fragments. So they're a combination of two complete sentences without the proper punctuation and coordinating conjunction, which again, coordinating conjunctions are those fanboys we talked about earlier. Run-on sentences are basically the most common issue that students have in their paper. We tend to speak with run-on sentences, right? Just because we, as Americans, we tend to speak very fast. Like if you ever meet somebody who doesn't speak English, they will say, wow, you talk very fast. That's kind of just part of who we are. And because of that, we tend to speak in run-on sentences because we just go and go and go and go. Our sentences continue on and on and on and on. So we tend to reflect that in our writing. So this is something to be very intentionally aware of in your writing, something to keep an eye out for when proofreading, okay? There are many, many, many ways to fix run-on sentences. These are just a few. We have separating into two different sentences, separating with a semicolon, and then adding a conjunction. I'll go over each of these three, but first take a look at this example up top. People are always trying to pit Taylor Swift and Beyonce against each other, but they support each other. They're actually friends. This may seem like a totally grammatically correct sentence, but I want you to pay attention to towards the very end, right between the word other and their. But they support each other, they're actually friends. That is where this becomes a run-on sentence, right between other and right between their, okay? So let's look at this first way to fix run-on sentences, separating into two sentences. So instead of what we have here, we could add a period and make it two different sentences. People are always trying to pit Taylor Swift and Beyonce against each other, but they support each other. Period. They're actually friends. We've split them up into two sentences. Fix the issue. No longer a run-on sentence. Grammatically correct. We're good to go. Second option, separate with a semicolon. We'll talk about semicolons in a little bit when we talk about punctuation. But just for now, no, it's basically the same thing as a period. So it's kind of like separating it into two sentences like this. People are always trying to pit Taylor Swift and Beyonce against each other, but they support each other, semicolon, they're actually friends. Hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense in a bit when we talk about semicolons, but for now, that is a way to fix run-on sentences, okay? Third, we have add a conjunction. People are always trying to pit Taylor Swift and Beyonce against each other, comma, but they support each other because they're friends. So that word because is called a conjunction. This is different than a coordinating conjunction, which is those fanboys. You don't really need to know the specifics, but just know that the word because is a conjunction. So just by adding that one single word, that fixes the grammatical issue altogether. People are always trying to pit Taylor Swift and Beyonce against each other, but they support each other because they're friends. We fixed the issue, no longer a run-on sentence, grammatically correct, we're good to go. Here are a few more ways to fix run-on sentences. So, new example, Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants and she received a lot of criticism for it. Again, when you read this, when you say it out loud, it sounds totally fine, right? But it is a run-on sentence. Take a second, pause the video, and I want you to try to figure out before I tell you where this sentence becomes a problem, where it becomes a run-on sentence. So pause the video for a second, take a look, and see if you can figure it out before we continue. Okay, hopefully you paused it. If not, that was a super awkward little pause. But this becomes a run-on sentence between contestants and. Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants. That is a complete sentence. And she received a lot of criticism for it. That is also a complete sentence. And remember, the combination of two complete sentences without the proper punctuation, that is the definition of a run-on sentence, right? So there's an issue here that we have to fix, okay? So we could use any of those first three that we talked about to fix this, but here are a few more that you could use. First, remove the coordinating conjunction and separate into two sentences, okay? So again, coordinating conjunctions are those fanboys we talked about. So the word, the coordinating conjunction we have here in this sentence is the word and, right? And is the A in fanboys, yeah? So if we just remove that and separate it into two sentences, we are good to go. Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants, period. Complete sentence. She received a lot of criticism for it, period. Second sentence, we are good to go. We fixed the issue, grammatically correct, great. Okay, next we can just remove the second subject. So if you remember earlier, we talked about what a subject and what a predicate is. A subject is that noun, right? So this sentence has two different subjects that it's focusing on, right? So we have Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants, and she received a lot of criticism for it. So she is the second subject here. It's technically a pronoun, but it's still considered a subject, right? So if we just remove the second subject, which is she, it fixes the problem. Great. Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants and received a lot of criticism for it. It is no longer a run-on sentence. Just by simply removing that second subject, we fix the issue. Lastly, adding a comma. Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants, comma, and she received a lot of criticism for it. Earlier on, we talked about combining two complete sentences, right? That required a comma and adding a coordinating conjunction. Our example already had the coordinating conjunction, right? Which was and. So because it already had that, all we had to do was add the comma. Tyra Banks yelled at one of the contestants, comma, and she received a lot of criticism for it. Fix the issue. I know this sounds confusing. Run-on sentences are one of the harder mistakes to catch. Again, that's why it's one of the most common mistakes to end up in papers, right? It's hard to see it. I will suggest to you again, read your sentences out loud, right? Read your papers out loud. When you do, your ears will catch mistakes, your eyes don't, and you're more likely to catch a mistake that way rather than just reading it silently in your head, okay? Please ask questions about run-on sentences if you have them. Again, this is one of those things that would be great to ask questions about in your question log, just because most students do have questions about it, or most students do have issues with run-on sentences, even if they don't know that they do, right? So if you're confused in any way, shape, or form about this, please ask, please let me know, and I'm happy to give some clarification. All right, now we are going to move on to talk about punctuation. This is one of the most important parts of our grammar lesson. Punctuation is just extremely important in general. So here we go. All right. So first and foremost, punctuation is more than just how to end a sentence, right? It's more than a question mark. It's more than a period. It's more than an exclamation point. It helps us understand how words relate to each other, right? More than just how a sentence ends, it shows us how one word relates to another. Really important, extremely crucial to the meaning of a sentence. And also, rules differ between style guides. So what that means is, in our class, we write an MLA format, and we'll talk about MLA format a bit in one of our lectures. But MLA is a specific style guide. If you study in the sciences, you may use APA format or Chicago style format, right? There are so many different style guides that we use, right? So punctuation rules may differ depending on which style guide you use, but just know the lessons that I'm teaching, the rules that we're going to go over for this class are specific to MLA format. So just know what goes for this class may not be the same same for your social sciences class, social studies, sciences in general, right? So again, this is for MLA format, not any other style guides, okay? So the comma. The comma is, outside of the period, I would say the most commonly used form of punctuation, right? It serves as the connective tissue of a sentence, right? So take a look at this example. Grammar just seems so boring, but it's still important to talk about. That comma connects the first thought, grammar just seems so boring, to the second thought, but it's still important to talk about, right? It serves as that connective tissue, making sure we understand how both parts of this expression are related to each other. The comma also very often determines meaning. We use these examples at the very beginning of our presentation to explain why using grammar properly is so important, right? Let's eat, Mom, which is you inviting your mom to eat with you, versus let's eat, Mom, meaning you are inviting somebody to cannibalize your own mother, right? The only difference in that sentence is that teeny tiny little comma, right? And that changes the meaning of the sentence completely. So it's really important that we know how to utilize this piece of punctuation properly. This next example, I love baking, my husband, and my friends. That is a list of things that you love, right? Versus the next part of the example, which is missing the commas, says, I love baking, my husband, and my friends. That is you saying that you love to bake your husband and bake your friends, right? Again, totally different meaning than the first. They are exactly the same words, but the commas that are being used completely changes the meaning. When do we know how to use a comma, right? There are a couple of different ways to know when to use a comma. The first is to separate independent clauses, which again means complete sentences. So to separate complete sentences joined by coordinating conjunctions. We have talked about this already, right? This prevents run-on sentences. So for example, I enjoy sleeping. We have the comma, but, which is our coordinating conjunction. It's the be in fanboys, right? I enjoy sleeping, comma, but I often sleep too much. You're using the comma and the coordinating conjunction to combine two complete sentences together, right? Beware the comma splice, okay? A comma splice is when you use a comma to connect two complete sentences without the coordinating conjunction. So look at this example. I enjoy sleeping. I often sleep too much, right? The only thing that's different here between the first example and the second example is the coordinating conjunction, is that little word but, right? That is a comma splice. It is grammatically incorrect. Students utilize comma splices very consistently. I guarantee you that you do this frequently without knowing that it is called a comma splice, right? So pay attention to that. When you combine two complete sentences, you have to use the comma, but you also need the coordinating conjunction in addition. Secondly, to separate dependent clauses from independent clauses. So again, dependent clauses, those are our incomplete sentences, right? Remember to look out for those danger words that we talked about at the beginning of sentences that set up that two-part expression, yeah? So take a look at the example. In order to pass this test, you have to study. So in order is one of those danger words, right? That's a danger phrase, really, because it's two different words, right? In order to pass this test, that is an incomplete sentence. Add the comma, you have to study. That is a complete sentence. So you use a comma to combine an incomplete sentence with a complete sentence to make it grammatically correct, completing the two-part expression. When to use a comma continued. When you are shifting between your own words and a quotation. We will talk about this much more in depth when we start to incorporate direct quotations into our writing. But it's good to know now that you use a comma when you start shifting from your own words into somebody else's words, right? So for example, Forrest Gump said, comma, life is like a box of chocolates. Yeah, Forrest Gump said that. In this sentence, it is you saying Forrest Gump said, comma, because you're shifting from your own words into Forrest Gump's words, right? Forrest Gump said, comma, life is like a box of chocolate. Using it to shift between your own words and a quotation, right? The exception to this rule is when you're introducing a quote with that, whether, or if. So look at this example. It's the same sentence, but I added the word that before the quote. Forrest Gump said that life is like a box of chocolates. Because I added the word that after said and before we introduced the quote, the comma is not needed. Why is that the case? I don't know. Somebody somewhere along the lines when we were deciding how we wanted to use the English language, somebody said, hey, remove that comma because you said that, whether, if. I can't tell you who said that. I can't tell you why they made that rule, but it is the rule, right? It's my job to teach you how to properly use MLA format, and this is just kind of one of those things. So is the rule silly? Maybe, but regardless, it is still a rule, so you do have to adhere to it, right? So we use a comma when we shift between our own words and a quote, except when you preface the quote with the word that, whether, or if, okay? Secondly, or fourth, because I guess this is a new slide about talking about commas. So you use a comma to separate clauses, phrases, and words that aren't essential to the sentence meaning, okay? This is applicable when extra information is added to a sentence. So that may sound confusing, but hopefully look at the example and it'll make more sense to you. The book, which sits on the shelf, is blue. So that sentence is telling you that the book is blue, right? That is the point of the sentence. So you are adding extra information by saying which sits on the shelf, right? You're saying where the book is, but regardless of where the book is, that doesn't change the fact that the book is blue, right? Which is what the sentence is trying to say. So we would add 2 commas to separate that extra information you're giving. The book, comma, which sits on the shelf, comma, is blue. So we use that comma to separate that extra little phrase in between that isn't necessarily essential to the meaning, right? Again, there is an exception, and it is again when the word that is involved, right? So if instead of the first example, we said, the book that sits on the shelf is blue, commas aren't needed. Why? Again, I don't know, but it is the rule, and it is important for you to know the rule. Here are 2 more ways of how to use a comma. Again, like I said, a comma is extremely important, so there are so many different ways to use them. Moving on to separating 3 or more items in a list, okay? This is called the Oxford comma when using MLA format. What this means is that we use a comma in between everything that we list, including the second to last item in a list and the last item, okay? This is an MLA requirement. It's one of those things that for some reason in academics, people are constantly debating whether or not we need to use the Oxford comma. Why it is so important to so many people, I literally can't tell you. I don't know why. But what I do know is we do use the Oxford comma when using MLA format, okay? So look at these 2 examples. The first says, I had a cinnamon roll, comma, eggs, comma, bacon, comma, and toast for breakfast. This is the correct utilization of the Oxford comma because there's a comma between the second to last item in the list, which is bacon, and the last item in the list, which is toast. The second example is incorrect because there is no comma between bacon and toast, right? So again, in a different style guide, the second one would be correct. But because we're using MLA format, that means we have to use the Oxford comma, which means that a comma comes after the second to last item in a list and the last item in a list, okay? Lastly, to separate 2 or more adjectives that describe the same noun. This is super self-explanatory. Look at the example. The beautiful, hilarious Professor White made class super fun, right? The most accurate sentence you've ever heard in your life, I'm sure, right? Especially after this lecture. But beautiful and hilarious are both describing the noun here, right? So we have a comma in between these two adjectives, right? So we use a comma to separate two or more adjectives that describe the same noun. Moving on to the semicolon. The semicolon is kind of this weird, unknown that people know it exists and we use it from time to time, but we don't really know why we would use it and why we wouldn't use it. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more clarification. This is essentially just another way to connect two complete sentences, right? So we use this when two sentences specifically are closely related. You wouldn't randomly use a semicolon to connect two sentences that have nothing to do with each other. It just doesn't make sense. In that case, you would just use a regular period. But when two different sentences are very closely related and have to do with one another, then we would use the semicolon. So look at this example. I have a busy day ahead. I need to finish my project, attend a meeting, and run some errands. Okay, so the first part, I have a busy day ahead, that is a complete sentence. Second part, I need to finish my project, attend a meeting, and run some errands. The first sentence is basically saying, I am busy. The second sentence is explaining why you are busy. So do you see how those two sentences, they relate to each other? They're closely connected, closely related. So it would be appropriate to use a semicolon. If the sentence was, I have a busy day ahead, I'm hungry. Those two things don't have anything to do with each other, right? So you would just use a period instead, not a semicolon. So to summarize that, we use a semicolon to connect two complete sentences that are closely related to each other. The fact that it's connecting two complete sentences is extremely important. You would never use a semicolon to connect a complete sentence and an incomplete sentence. Only two complete sentences that are closely related to each other, okay? There are a couple of things to know when using a semicolon. The first word after the semicolon should be lowercase unless it's a proper noun. So in the example that I gave you, it is a proper noun, the word I, right? So it is capitalized. But if it wasn't capitalized, if it wasn't a proper noun, it would not be capitalized. Look at the last example that's coming up. That's a better explanation of that, okay? This is only applicable when you are not using a coordinating conjunction, okay? You can only use a semicolon when there is no coordinating conjunction. So, example of incorrect usage. I know I should be tired, but I have so much energy. The word but is the be in fanboys, which are coordinating conjunctions, right? So because the sentence starts with but, it's not appropriate to use a semicolon, okay? So to summarize this whole slide, we use a semicolon to connect two complete sentences that are closely related to each other. The first word after the semicolon should be lowercase unless the word is a proper noun. And you can only use a semicolon when there's no coordinating conjunction at the beginning of the second sentence. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I know all of this can be very overwhelming and confusing. And again, if you have questions, please let me know and I'm happy to clarify. Last but not least, we have the colon. So the semicolon is the dot and the comma. The colon is just the two dots, okay? No comma. We use a colon to introduce a list of items after an independent clause, which again is a complete sentence. So for example, the playlist included some iconic 90s bands, NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, and Weezer. So we are listing the iconic 90s bands that are in this playlist. So we use a semicolon. A colon. It's confusing, I know, even for me. Bear with me. We also use a colon to emphasize a single word or phrase at the end of a complete sentence. So for example, there's only one thing worse than death, colon, heartbreak. The colon just really brings home a little extra emphasis for that last word. Why? Because when we see punctuation like that, that should cue to us that there is some kind of pause, right? So when you see a comma in a sentence, we automatically take like a brief pause before we continue reading the sentence after the comma. The same goes with a colon. You see the colon after the word death, that indicates that there's a brief pause and then you move on. There's only one thing worse than death, heartbreak, right? Pause, bring some emphasis home to that single word or phrase. A great use of the colon, not used super frequently, but it's very powerful when used correctly, so please keep that in mind. All right, you made it to the end of your first lecture. I know it was extremely thrilling and you were at the edge of your seat the whole time. Realistically, I know grammar is not everyone's favorite thing to talk about. It's very dry. It can be very boring, but you made it to the end. You stuck with it. Thank you for bearing with me. I promise you that the content of this class is a lot more interesting than what you've seen in your first lecture. But kind of what I said at the very beginning of this lecture, it's so important to make sure that we are all starting out this class with the same foundation. We have to understand these basic rules to understand anything else. So if this was a refresher to you, hopefully it was refreshing. If you haven't heard any of these terms before, I can't imagine how overwhelmed you probably feel right now. But if that's the case, please come see me and we can talk about this more and really make sure that you understand this before jumping into anything else. I look forward to hearing what questions you guys had from this lecture that you wrote down in your question log. And I will see you at the next lecture.